The Forum at 8 with Sakina Kamwendo on AM Live, turning the spotlight on the big issues and the people behind them.
9 minutes after 8. Thank you so much for tuning into the Forum at 8. As various groups in South Africa seek a total ban on corporal punishment, the South African Human Rights Commission has ordered the Joshua Generation Church in Cape Town to stop advocating spanking. They believe that this impacts negatively on children's social, cognitive, behavioral and intellectual development, and that includes a loving little smack. However, the church is adamant that it will not stop spanking as a discipline tool by parents. So on the Forum at 8 this morning, we ask, is spanking an acceptable form of discipline for children? And you can call us on 0891 104 208. You can also tweet or Facebook us at AM Live on SAFM or at Sakina Kamwendo. Alternatively, send us an SMS to the number 34701. It's at a cost of R1. And joining us for the discussion this morning, South African Human Rights Commission Provincial Manager in the Western Cape, Karam Singh. Thanks so much for your time.
Thank you, Sakina, and good morning.
And we also have with us Philip Rosenthal, who is the director of the Christian View Network. Thanks for your time as well.
Hi there.
Now, let me start with you, Mr. Rosenthal. What do you think is the real issue here?
Well, I would say, look, on the surface, the issue is the debate around spanking, but there's two more serious issues behind this. The one is the rights of parents versus the rights of the state, and the other one is the right to religious freedom. And we would argue that the South African Human Rights Commission has overstepped its mandate and is now encroaching on both of these other rights, and we would ask them to move back into their real mandate.
And Mr. Singh, what's your response to that? Have you overstepped your bounds here, as Mr. Rosenthal alleges?
I don't think so, Sakina. Just to remind listeners, the Human Rights Commission is a Chapter 9 body created by the Constitution to promote respect for the Bill of Rights, to promote a culture of human rights in the country. In terms of the complaint that we received in this matter, we dealt with the complaint the way that we deal with all of our complaints, which is to understand what's the nature of this complaint in relationship to our obligations in terms of the Constitution. And when we looked at the issue of corporal punishment and the fact that at present it's not explicitly outlawed in terms of our current law, we found it very difficult to sustain the position that, based upon our understanding of the Bill of Rights and also our understanding of South Africa's obligations in terms of the international obligations, particularly in terms of its ratification on the Convention on the Rights of the Child, that we could sustain a view that domestic violence, that corporal punishment in any setting, particularly within the domestic setting, could be deemed lawful or consistent with constitutional principles.
Mr. Singh, does the Human Rights Commission draw a distinction between a spanking and corporal punishment, or do you see it as one and the same thing?
Sakina, I think it's extremely difficult to draw these lines, and this is really where the problem comes in, and I think why we've seen this international trend now towards a total prohibition. And I think we need to take a step back and recognize that we live in a particularly violent society, a society with some of the highest.
Okay, we're going to try and see if we can get Mr. Singh back on a better line there. The quality on that one fading. But in the meantime, Mr. Rosenthal, I was just reading through this information, and apparently the manual that was issued by the Joshua Generation Church had 4 pages that focused on the issue of spanking, that topic in itself. So have you been able to read through that, and what's your takeaway from it?
Well, I've reviewed the manual, and yes, essentially there's 4 pages that deal with spanking, includes the quotation of 5 Bible verses, and then the rest of the 3 pages is used just explaining to parents how they can do that in a non-abusive way that doesn't cause any emotional or physical or relational harm. And so we would argue that trying to associate this type of manual with child abuse is quite ridiculous, and that really this is a Bible interpretation, and this is infringing on their right, both of religious freedom and free speech, to interpret the Bible. But I would also just want to rebut what Mr. Singh has just said, that I believe that he's misinterpreted these international obligations, in that really the idea that that spanking needs to be outlawed is based on a commentary document of the United Nations document. It's not based on the actual treaty that's been agreed to, and that commentary document is not binding on the member states. And many of the other signatories, such as the United States and Australia, also have legal spanking. In fact, most of them do. And so really the Human Rights Commission has not, in my view, done their legal homework on this issue. I also would dispute the view that was put forward by Mr. Isaac McGenna, of the Human Rights Commission, in a previous debate, where he claimed that spanking was already illegal. It's only illegal in schools. It's still legal in the home, and the Constitutional Court acknowledged that in the year 2000, when the issue was brought to the court, and they said the only area where it has been made illegal through statute law is in the schools.
So how does the Bible define spanking? What is spanking?
Well, the Bible has got 5 scriptures which discuss the issue of spanking, and it says that he who spares the rod hates his son, but he who loves him is careful to discipline him. It says, folly is bound up in the heart of a child, but the rod of discipline will drive it far from him. And a number of scriptures of a similar sort. And so really the Bible would say that this is the loving thing to do, and this is what is best for your child. And we know from opinion polls that 14 out of 15 South Africans that have responded to the News 24 opinion poll agree with what the Bible says, that this is the loving thing to do for your child.
And how would you distinguish between a spanking and a beating?
Well, I think there's possibly could be a debate on the subject, but a parental spanking is usually done on the bottom, which is an area where there is very little risk of any sort of injury being caused. We would say that one would definitely not encourage hitting a child on any other part of the body where you would have a risk of causing harm, such as if somebody hits their child on the head. That is dangerous medically, and so a gentle spanking is something which is done with self-control. It's not done as an outburst of anger, and so it's done for the good of the child, to train them the right way to live.
But inevitably, when people spank, they don't spank when they're in a good mood. They don't spank because they're feeling good about something. They spank because they've reached a certain level of frustration generally and are outraged by something which the child may have done, and therefore they are retaliating, as it were.
Well, the Christian teaching materials that would promote spanking, which includes the materials that Joshua Generation was using, and also the most popular book on the subject, which is called Dare to Discipline. You can download that on Kindle by James Dobson. Would argue that you should not spank in a moment of frustration and anger. That you need to cool your own emotions and restrain yourself, so that you do so in a measured way. And certainly, if a particular individual has a problem with self-control, if they are a person who's struggling with violence or whatever, then for that individual, spanking is not a good idea. It's something which the parent needs to be in control of themselves and self-discipline before they try and give discipline to their child.
But how would you control that? How would you know when the parent is in control? Because I think, history is littered with evidence, and most of us listening or speaking here on this discussion today know that, when it happened, it was in many instances quite brutal, quite severe.
I think the parent needs to learn to restrain their own anger, as one needs to control your own emotions in many different ways, and one hopes that they've learned that at that stage of life. But certainly, I think if the person is completely losing their cool, then they need to maybe to wait a bit for themselves to cool down, or maybe the other parent needs to give the spanking. But it definitely should not be done in a moment as a release of frustration. Then that is a situation where there is a risk that it can be abusive.
Are there any other methods other than spanking that could perhaps be used to discipline children?
Well, yes, and I think we wouldn't advocate spanking as a first resort. There's other methods such as giving the child time out and leaving them maybe in their room for a little while to cool off, or taking away privileges if it's an older child, or giving them a reprimand. But these other methods can also be abused if they are not done in a loving and controlled manner. If a parent says something that's really unpleasant to the child, that can also be very emotionally damaging. So it's not only physical actions that can be abusive, and all of these things need to be well controlled. But we believe that the Bible gives a manual on many different subjects about how to run a family and how to bring up children. And if we follow all of these different instructions together, it gives a much better chance of having a successful family.
Mr. Singh, we have you back. You've been listening to what Mr. Rosenthal has been saying. So what's your response to all of this? Controlled spanking is what he's talking about.
Sakina, can you hear me a bit better now?
I can, yes.
Yes. So I can't hear everything that Mr. Rosenthal is saying, but I think where I was going previously was to say that it's from the standpoint of the Commission, it's very difficult for us to think about how we can draw these lines between restrained, kind, loving spanking and the type of scenario that you were painting. I think that the jumping off point for the Commission is, what does it mean to have a society that respects human rights, and particularly that protects the most vulnerable in our society from the potential abuses and excesses of violence? We live in an extremely violent society. We've got some of the highest levels of rape, domestic violence, intimate femicide, and community violence. We've got a lot of vulnerable children in our society, some of whom are living in child-headed households, some of whom are living with single parents. A combination of these stresses, I think, critically makes children extremely vulnerable to severe corporal punishment. We've now moved on as a society to say that corporal punishment is not acceptable in a correctional services prison type of setting. That's been banned. We further moved on to say that it's no longer acceptable in a school setting, that where it was allowed for decades. We're saying, what is the difference? What is the reasonable difference between that setting and the domestic setting? The vulnerability that children face requires that they must have equal protection of the laws the same way that all of us do. In fact, children deserve special protection of the law. So they would not be lawful in any context for adults to engage in assault or disciplining of each other. So why would we allow a circumstance like that where children would be subjected to that type of violence?
And that's a very good question. And I want to bring our listeners in here, because I think that's a good question to also put out to our listeners. If that sort of behavior is not acceptable when we are interacting with each other as adults, where you can't exactly go and reprimand the next person physically for, whatever they may have done to wrong you, why is it acceptable behavior towards children? That, along with our question this morning, is spanking an acceptable form of discipline for children, is what we want you to respond to. 0891 104 208. Dave in Durban, good morning.
Thank you for taking my call. Firstly, just to answer, yes, in my family, spanking is very, very acceptable. And I'll just go on just to paraphrase a few scriptures. In Joshua, it actually says, no, as for me and my family, I will worship the Lord. And also, there is another scripture as well that says, no, parents who mislead their children, it's better for them on the day of judgment, for them to be actually thrown into the sea with a stone tied on their neck, than the judgment they will face. Right. What I'm trying to say here is that, children are gifts from God. And the Bible stipulates clearly how we as parents need to we have got a mandate to bring up our children in a way that glorifies Him. So when actually one of your guests is speaking about, control that are thinking, that's exactly what it offers. Because what happens is that, if you also read some scriptures, it says, for husbands, to their wives, love your wives as Christ loved the church, right? Laying down His life for the church, right? So this means actually that spanking can only be done with love, because I remember, some years back when I had to spank my son, I would never spank him when I'm angry. It would be so difficult for me to spank him because I'll be smiling, I'll be full of love, but I know it's something that we have spoken about. It has to be done, right? That's the kind of, of spanking we're talking about here, not the abusive one. Because remember, as I said earlier, children are a gift from God, and we are supposed to bring them up in the manner that God mandated us as parents to do that. Because if we don't do that, we are failing the children. Because how many kids now, if you had Sakina, that they'll grow up and come to a parent one day and say, Mom, Dad, you did not teach me these things when I was young. Why didn't you do this to me? Why didn't you spank me when I was doing wrong? How many stories do we have? How
many parents have looked at alternatives to spanking? Why is that the first go-to for parents when it comes to disciplining children?
Okay, I think if you heard me correctly, that is not the first way. I said, like the example I gave of my son, we'll talk about stuff. We'll look at other things. But at the end of the day, what you're trying to instill in a young child's mind is, where you do wrong, there are consequences, right? So they're not harsh, but they're actually full of love. So talking to kids, because the other thing is that we are also taught to teach. You can only teach when you're talking to someone, right? So that is teaching. We talk, but there are actions that must be taken after the talking. Where you see that the talking is not having a maximum effect of or the required results are not being attained by just talking.
Right, thank you so much, Dave in Durban and Solly in Johannesburg. What's your take?
Hi, Sakina and guests. Human beings are naturally ill-disciplined, and that is why even the adults today, you've got the Center of Correctional Services. That is why we've got the traffic fines and so on, because of this natural ill-discipline that we have. So each and every society needs to create its own restraints in order to put people in order. So it is very, very important that even that becomes applicable to the children. So we need to discipline them. But the problem now is that the people sometimes, as you said earlier on, that they do it out of frustration. It should not be like that, like the previous callers. At the center of everything, there must be love. Because of what you're doing, you are raising children, and then you want them to be disciplined. So if you do it for other reasons, other than the one that I've mentioned, that at the center of everything, there must be love, and then it will become something else, not what we are talking about this morning. Thank you.
So when people beat their children up, does this mean that they don't love their children? Because can't it be argued that they got to that point of beating them up out of sheer frustration, that they want this child to go in a certain direction, and the child for some reason doesn't, and they end up beating the child up? And I'm using beating as opposed to spanking, because that happens. Does that mean that they don't love the child?
At that moment, I suspect, Sakina, that that feeling of love, maybe it is not present whenever you beat the child to the point whereby maybe you have his or her face deformed or something like that. So, but if you discipline a child, even the onlooker can tell that the parent is disciplining a child and not doing something else.
All right. Thank you, Solly in Johannesburg. Eddie in Edenvale, good morning. Hello, Eddie.
It's ironical that the various religions are in the forefront of advocating violence when they should be preaching tolerance. Children learn what they become what they learn from their parents in a formative age. So that's why there's so much road rage and so on. You don't like what someone's doing when he become an adult. You beat him up because you didn't like what he did in the traffic. And you'll notice that they always quote from the Old Testament, which was 2,000 years ago. The Christian religion, which they propose to follow, nowhere in the Christian text or Jesus said there's nothing there that they can quote from as violence. And to end off, I was a rebellious teenager, so I learned, we used to brag about the cuts we used to get. We used to show our friends it was bravado. Then for my sins, I got sent to a wonderful school, reformative school called Boys Town, where that was 30 years ago. They were way ahead of their time. There was no corporal punishment there. You were rewarded. They had a wonderful headmaster called Father Osmond. The children idolized him. We were all from difficult backgrounds, deprived backgrounds. There were very rebellious teenagers there, and not one. And they all sort of fell into that wonderful non-violent stance, and most of them turned out to be wonderful adults. So I think that people should think again. The modern way and the modern Bible was totally against that violent attitude of 2,000 years ago, which these religious demagogues love to quote from that violent period.
Okay. That's how we're going to leave it for now, Eddie. We'll continue taking your calls after the news break. 0891 104 208. Kumbuzile Tabete is standing by with the headlines.
Here, Bosakina, looking ahead in the 9 o'clock bulletin, the ANC Youth League says the public should refrain from aligning the ANC with the Gupta family. But more on that story at 9 o'clock. Here's a wrap of some of our top stories this morning. EFF leader Julius Malema will today hold a media briefing in Johannesburg after President Jacob Zuma said he would pay back some of the money spent on non-security features at his private home in Nkandla. Public Protector Tulima Donzela says that her team is still studying the legal implications of President Zuma's offer to pay back a portion of the 246 million rand spent on the non-security upgrades at his private home in Nkandla. The Western Cape Health Department has issued a warning to pregnant women not to travel to South American countries that the Zika virus has affected. Eskom has confirmed that it served notice of its intention to suspend electricity supply to 8 Free State municipalities on March the 30th due to continued non-payment. And a U.S. judge says prosecutors can proceed with a sexual assault charge against comedian Bill Cosby. More news at 9 o'clock.
Traffic on SAFM, your trusted guide to the road ahead.
Yeah, very good morning. Just a reminder to avoid Sabi through Mpumalanga. Quite aggressive protesting there this morning. We've been asking you to avoid it because the roads are blocked, and SAP's now joining in with exactly that advice. You won't be able to get through Sabi until this public order situation is under control. Other issues this morning, a nice amount of rain in Polokwane, so expect some slow traffic and drive carefully. Lights on, slow down through PLK. There is some surface water and flooding issues as well. Big truck crash still being recovered between Villiers and Warden, just south of the road, Frankfurt Freda exit, going down to a sort of roadside rates. Traffic in that section now again under stop controls. The road was closed, stop goes, closed for recovery, stop goes again. So just massive backlog of vehicles and a lot of trucks are getting caught there between Villiers and Warden. Port Elizabeth very heavy this morning. The M2, Blue Water Bay in towards the M4, Settlers Waste, but it's the roadworks. But we're hearing there may have been a crash. Durban, heavy traffic again on the N N2. Today it's a truck fire up by Queen Nundy Drive, so big queues up over Umgena Road towards Queen Nundy. The M4 at this stage looks a better option to get you out of central Durban and up towards the airport area for flight connections. Cape Town, the N2, broken down vehicle at Mowbray Main Road, causing some very heavy delays still. The N2 backing up from Robert Sobukwe. The M5 is heavy coming up from Kenilworth, and very heavy traffic when there's problems on the N2 and M5. A lot of motorists just duck down and use Klipfontein Road, so in from Athlone through to Mowbray, that's heavy. And the run-up on Campground Road, Lisbeth Parkway coming up through sort of Rondebosch and Rosebank area, that's really heavy as well. Main Road looks your better option from the southern suburb sides. Rob Byrne, AM Live, Traffic Watch.
Thank you, Rob. Let's find out what's coming up on Morning Talk with Rowena.
Thank you, Sakina. Good morning to you. We're going to be talking about whether the International Criminal Court is targeting Africa inappropriately. And then we'll find out more about those high-tech devices that some motorists use to block their number plates so that they can dodge speed cameras and e-tolls. On the small business feature, we'll talk about the Mzansi Business Forum and how it benefits entrepreneurs. And then we'll look into the rights of foreign parents in South Africa. That's just some of what's to come on Morning Talk today between 9 and midday. Thank you, Sakina.
Thank you so much, Rowena. Back to the forum at 8. And this morning, we are asking, is spanking an acceptable form of discipline for children? And looking at the messages coming through, people grappling with the difference, trying to discern between what is a beating and what is spanking, and also the difference between corporal punishment and spanking. And then, of course, the question of a government reaching into people's homes through Chapter 9 institutions like the Human Rights Commission, and people talking about not being allowed to be themselves, to raise their children in a manner in which they see fit, and not wanting to be policed. Also, some talking about ideological givings or misgivings, as you will, and so many other questions rising here. But we want to hear from you. Is spanking an acceptable form of discipline for children? And if so, why? And I just want to read some of the messages very quickly, starting with those on Twitter. Kakisha Moeng says, SK, I'm a new father of a boy who turns 1 next week, and I'm going to discipline my son anyhow I deem suitable. Sigalelwa Mdingi says, this was so sad. My 2-year-old's first proper words were Ndizagubeta, which means I'll hit or spank you. And that's because we say it all the time. No more. And a few others here as well from Prince. Prince says, for some of us, it was you versus your parents' stamina. I wouldn't know about spanking, and how and when you cry determined when the spanking, the beating would end. Don says, spanking is necessary for children, but you do it with love and support, and thus makes a child to learn right from wrong. Mr. V says, what rights do we as parents have over our children? Because it seems as if they have all the rights while we have none whatsoever. Yuri says, if anything, a mother's spanking instilled cognitive awareness, and thus the awareness in general had to be aware to duck those hot claps. Bonga says, there are those types of things that peddle ill discipline in kids. Nothing wrong with spanking, but beating and assault is wrong. And of course, where do you draw the line? That is what we are grappling with this morning. Let me give our guests a chance to respond to your input. Mr. Singh?
I think the first thing to say, Sakina, is that there's not uniformity across religion or religious faiths on this view, on this idea that corporal punishment is somehow legitimate. All the major came together to commit themselves to nonviolence in the raising of children when they declared the Declaration on Advanced Shared Societies at the 8th World Assembly of Religions in August 2006. So the second thing I want to say is that, the issue for the Human Rights Commission isn't into the private sphere and trying to overreach. We live in a new society.
Okay, Mr. Singh,
a new society.
I'm going to put you back to the producers once again, because I want that to be clear as you're talking about reaching into the private sphere and how that is not the objective for the Human Rights Commission. So we'd rather do that on a clear line. Mr. Rosenthal, your view, your input, your response to what the listeners were saying?
Well, I think there's several issues that have been raised, but the big one for us is that we really do believe that the Human Rights Commission is overreaching both on this issue and on a number of other issues, and this is why we're planning to bring this to the Parliamentary Oversight Committee on Justice. They've been interfering with a number of different churches, with a number of different schools in terms of their religious policy, which is really not their mandate. They are meant to be there to deal with real human rights abuse issues which are clear in the law. Here they are engaging as an advocacy organization, trying to promote a new view to try and change the law, and they're intimidating a church, Joshua generation, as if the law has already changed, and it is as if their rights to communicate their beliefs have already been taken away from them. This is just not true. They, for example, ordered Joshua generation to send their trainers and pastors on a course to teach them the opposite view. Now, this to me is like out of some Stalinist country. This is not a democratic country if you are forced to go on a course. Now, Joshua generation argues they don't even have the right to force their people to go on the course if they don't want to. I think these people fundamentally misunderstand the Constitution. At the same time, we've also just had a case where the government has taken away some children from a family that was homeschooling for 8 months. Eventually, they won a court battle to get their children back again. These people seem to think that they have ownership over the children, which they don't. The parents have the right to control the children. Now, in terms of this argument about violence, we would argue quite the opposite. There's 5 reasons why not spanking children is going to lead to more violence. The first one is that undisciplined children grow up to become violent adults. We know that because most of these violent people are coming from single-parent households where they didn't have a father to discipline them when they were teenagers, and they grew up rebellious. Then, secondly, the resources of the police and the courts are limited. They are not being successful at prosecuting real child abusers at the moment with their limited resources, and this is going to now stretch their resources that they're now going to waste on good parents and punish those parents just by bringing them into court. It's also going to make parents, if they don't spank in a mild way, they're going to get more and more frustrated. There's a risk that they lash out. The disobedient children, rebellious children, are more likely to engage in risky behavior, such as reckless driving or whatever, and hurt themselves. I would also argue that the big risk that people need to also know about is actually not spanking on the bottom. The big risk is doing other things, like, for example, jerking a child's arm. You can dislocate a child's arm even without trying to punish them, but just because the parent is a whole lot stronger. So those are arguments why we think this is not going to help on the violence situation.
And what about the rights issue that the Human Rights Commission talks about, the rights of the child?
Look, I think the thing is that this whole concept of human rights came from a Christian understanding and from the Bible, and it's got a precedent which has come through the centuries where people have debated what those rights are. Now, what has happened is that people have taken a few of those rights now, and they're taking them out of balance and out of context, and they're making them an absolute. And certainly the Bible would not take things to that, as Christian view of law would not take things to that extreme. If you look at this whole, what I would call individual rights only experiment in the family, it's turning out to be a bigger and bigger disaster. If you look at the countries where it's being implemented, we see all of these countries are dropping the number of people getting married by 2% every year. The family is starting to disintegrate. There's more and more children growing up illegitimate, more children growing up rebellious. It's an experiment which is not working, and it's time for us to stop the experiment and say, well, just like Marxism in the 20th century was an experiment that failed, this experiment of focusing purely on individual rights and neglecting the family is an experiment that has failed. And we are not going to let the Human Rights Commission experiment on our children with some idea that they have read from some academic professor or something like that.
Mr. Singh?
Yeah, look, I don't know exactly. It's difficult for me to respond directly to that. I mean, the international trend that we're looking at is over 50 countries who've come to the conclusion that we cannot draw the line between a gentle spanking and child abuse. We have something every November called 16 Days of Activism Against Violence Against Women and Children. How do we realize that throughout the rest of the year? What I believe is that the Constitution has raised the bar. We come from a society, we come from a history that's characterized by racial segregation, by patriarchy, by violence. In that old system, women and children were deemed as less than full citizens. What the Bill of Rights and the Constitution does now is said that we've moved away from that society. We've built a bridge to a new society, a society where we do not resolve our conflicts through force, and we do not resolve our conflicts through violence. So if you look at the provisions around the rights of a child, whether it be around the best interests of a child, whether it be about freedom from maltreatment, neglect, abuse, and degradation, whether it be about the freedom and security of the person, whether it be around the right to equal protection of the laws, and whether it be around the issue of the right to dignity. The Human Rights Commission cannot come up with an interpretation of corporal punishment within a domestic setting which is consistent with any of those principles. So I believe the experiment that's being referred to is the experiment of constitutional democracy. And if we're committed to building a society based upon the principles of the Constitution, based upon the principles of human rights, then it becomes very, very difficult to understand how a notion of corporal punishment, even if it's done in a loving, gentle context, outside of the glare within the private sphere, can be consistent with those human rights principles.
We're going to go back to the lines now, but just a quick one here from Gamu Roger, who says children are ill-disciplined because of parental exhaustion, where parents relegate their roles to schools, and he says no to this rot. Let's go to the lines, 0891 104 208. Wessel van der Berg from Sonke Gender Justice. Good morning. What's your take on all of this?
Good morning, Sakina, and thank you for taking my call. Sonke Gender Justice is one of the original complainants, along with the Mostert couple, to the Human Rights Commission, who laid the complaint to the Commission. And it's great to have the opportunity to speak to that. My first comment is that I am a parent, and my child is just over 2 years old now, which is a very active time for young children. And I had never felt the urge nor the need to raise my hand and to punish her physically at any moment. And that was because I made the decision that I will not hurt my child, nor my wife, nor anybody in my family. So firstly, I think, regardless of parenting skills, it is a core decision that a parent can make, which would make all the difference. We welcome the report. It is a fantastic document. And I'm very happy to hear from the Joshua Generation Church that they are not advocating corporal punishment. They've said that in their press release and in the media, and that we welcome that. So that's wonderful news. I also like Philip's point that he said that spanking should be a last resort. I would say that it should be no resort, and that the other 4 things you do before that would be the way to go. But I really appreciate that. I think the main point for us is to move beyond the religious debate, because the South African Council of Churches, the Catholic Bishops' Conference, and other mainstream, large representative religious bodies have already, years ago, expressed their support for the prohibition of corporal punishment. For me, the main step forward is the one that the Department of Social Development should take, as mandated or as recommended by the Commission's report, to actually forge ahead with the amendment that is due in the near future to prohibit corporal punishment in the home. We see that as a very progressive step. As Karam says, the rate of countries that are taking this step is increasing, and we would like to commend Minister Dlamini for the fact that she has expressed herself on the matter and committed to taking that step forward.
Thank you so much, Wessel van der Berg, for that input from the Sonke Gender Justice Network there. And we're going to hear now from Kristen in Durban. Good morning.
Good morning. I believe that South Africans, both criminals and non-criminals, have a sentimental attachment to violence. And it's just, behind the reasonable words of some of the people advocating corporal punishment, just don't forget that it's how many years since farmers stopped beating their farm workers? Because that's the attitude that is still being put forward as the kind of solution. There's a study coming out by Dr. Chandra Gould interviewing very violent criminals. And I was struck when I read that to see that most of these people did not grow up in situations of no discipline. They grew up in situations of strong discipline and the constant use of corporal punishment to discipline those children. And that experience of violence is generating some of the high levels of violence that we see in the society. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Christian. And Kalala, you're in Cape Town.
Yeah, thanks for taking the call. I'm going to first say that there's nothing wrong with discipline. There is a French word that says, qui aime bien, châtie bien. That means whoever loves well, discipline well. Discipline cannot be enjoyable to the kids. So any form of discipline, as long as it's done with love. I'm a parent, and I have been a kid also by my father's house. I will be honest with you, my father used to hit me if I go over the limit. In my house, I never beat my daughter, but my wife does. And she respects it. When my wife says stop, she stops immediately. But what I'm trying to say is this. We all have rights because we are all human. Kids and children, and as parents. But the point is this. Children's rights are this. They must be loved. They must be disciplined as well. If we don't discipline our children, then we don't give them another right. And we have also rights. Our children must obey us as a parent. So when they make the time that a parent wants to smack a child in the bum, it doesn't mean that he hates the child. Not at all. He wants what is the best for the kids. But when the Bible talks of with dignified manners, not irritating our children, is the place and how you do it. You cannot beat your child in public. You can take your child away somewhere there in the corner and you smack at them. You tell her, I don't want this anymore because of this. And you tell her the reason why. And you tell her, if you do next time, you're going to again have this, then the child definitely is going to obey. It's not that you hate your child. Please, let us not go on spoiling kids when they do bad. We say, no, sorry, baby. No, when your child does wrong, it's wrong. When he does well, you compliment the child, you appreciate that. That's how we can raise responsible children in this world. Like I say, my dad used to smack me, and then I grew up alone in this country. I came in 15 years, now I'm 33 years. No mistake, no nonsense, because my dad used to do well with me.
Thank you so much, Kalala, and we'll continue with this after the break.
Take a look at your hands. They're not just hands. They're communicators. They're always sending and receiving. Always tapping, texting, typing, talking, striving, high-fiving. Grabbing someone's hand. Grabbing opportunities. Grabbing life. Every day, your hands send a signal to the world about who you are right now, about who you want to be tomorrow. That's why this year, I'm using my hands to register and vote in the municipal elections, because my tomorrow is in my hands. Register at your voting station on 5 and 6 March from 8 a.m. to 5 p.m. Visit elections.org.za or dial *120* IEC#. That's *120*432# to find your voting station. A message from the Electoral Commission, ensuring free and fair elections.
Now they're taking the decision upstairs, John. This is going to be a close call. The home side with everything to play for here. Have they done enough?
One decision can change it all. The right call can transform opportunity into measurable results. Make the right call for your business. Partner with a CASA today. You imagine a chartered accountant. We see a business decision maker equipped to inspire future business results. Find a responsible business leader at findacasa.co.za.
Sakina Kamwendo on SAFM.
This morning we are asking whether spanking is an acceptable form of discipline for children. Our guest, Karam Singh, who is from the South African Human Rights Commission, is a provincial manager in the Western Cape, and Philip Rosenthal, director of Christian View Network. And we have so many messages. Let me run through as many of them as I can. SMS line, I've got some from Twitter and Facebook as well. But let me start with the SMSs. This one says, I hit my child for stealing. He then said he was going to lay a charge against me, and then I kicked him out of my house. How old was the child? I'd really be interested to know. This one says, you're a terrible parent if you hit a child. The child would resort to violence when faced with a problem. Rosenthal must get lost with these archaic superstitions. Not all of us subscribe to fairy tales. This one says, upholding the rule of law with force is barbaric to begin with, and convincing a child to alter behavior should require creative thinking and not violence. David says, if a child crawls along the floor and touches the hot stove, he won't do it again. Pain teaches us not to pick roses without gloves. Even baboon mothers slap their babies. So why must we go against nature? That's from David. Anthony says, an early child's brain has not developed reason and to understand basically what's right from wrong. This unsigned one says, these human rights groups are so corrupt that they mislead people in so many things. The commission itself must be investigated. And then Nick says, if spanking was good enough for me, my parents and my grandparents, and it did not turn us into monsters, then it's good enough for my kids. The next one says, biblical texts used by those who claim that these texts advocate spanking are contested by scholars. For example, spare the rod and spoil the child. This one says, teach a child how he should live and he will remember it all his life. That's from Proverbs. And another one says, it's a choice to obey God or please people and perish. Couples are matured. If they differ, they divorce but not fight. That's from Ndluli. James in Durban says, discipline between wrong and right at an early age is necessary. The only people that benefit from non-discipline are criminals and lawyers. I love my child and I will spank to discipline, not abuse. This one, rich families may take privileges as alternative punishment. Poor families only have spanking, and as such, there are no privileges. Dumi says, yes, 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 and again, yes. Mageba says, if the wife beating, is wife beating also a Bible teaching? The Calvinists previously used the Bible to oppress black people, and now it's used to abuse children. Hands off our children. Brian in Polokwane says, without corporal punishment, all society becomes evil. The evidence is in the violence of society today compared to that of the past. Gondo says, there's a danger in taking few isolated violent punishment as spanking. Spanking poses no danger to kids. Punish children abuse, not spanking. And then many more on Twitter as well. But we will storify them. So you can go to our websites and other platforms to see what everybody's been saying, because clearly parents are mulling over this. But what I'm sensing right now, Mr. Singh and Mr. Rosenthal, is that there's a lot of generalization and a lot of inferences being drawn. And I'm failing to hear any empirical evidence either way to support either of these arguments. So how do we wrap this up in terms of deciding whether spanking is an acceptable discipline for children? Mr. Singh?
Thanks, Sakina. I mean, it's a difficult question. It's clear from the comments coming from the callers that this is an issue which is divisive and which is dividing people. On the one hand, there's a lot of common sense that parents should be empowered to raise their children as they see fit. I think the challenge for us and
we'll come back to Mr. Singh. Mr. Rosenthal?
Well, in terms of empirical evidence, it wouldn't be ethical to have a completely scientific test that you eliminated all other variables and you tested a whole lot of children to see which turned out whether they were better if they were spanking or not, because there are many factors involved. But what we do know is that the Bible has a number of different instructions on how to run a family, and those who follow these instructions as a set tend to have much more successful families. It's also the same values that are supported by African culture and by Western culture, which have been tested through thousands of years. These new ideas have only come along in the last 100 years. There's also been many other crazy ideas such as that have been put forward, such as that you must never hug your child. We would laugh at this, but these are psychologists have said. Now, in terms of the argument that this is constitutional democracy, I would say no, that's not correct. If you read the Constitution correctly, quite the opposite. It gives certain rights to parents, to churches, for independent things, and this is a particular interpretation of the Constitution based on a radical anti-family view that's coming out of the Northern Hemisphere. It's not part of African culture. These groups are funding South African NGOs to push their agenda. It is not even a South African thing at all. In terms of what he was saying about trends in other countries, even if what he's saying is correct, that's only a fifth of the countries in the world that have adopted that viewpoint. We've also got the oldest constitutional democracy. The American one has been functioning for 250 years without this particular viewpoint of outlawing corporal punishment. But here the issue is really not around corporal punishment. The issue is about the rights of the family, the rights of free religious teachings, and those are very clear in the Constitution. And I would say that the Human Rights Commission is actually at fault here, and the same on a number of other issues where they've decided to try and bully individuals, churches, and schools to try and push this radical Northern Hemisphere ideology. And I think that parents have to stand up, as they did in 2003 when Kader Asmal tried to force all schools to follow his religious policy, and the parents said, no, through our governing bodies, we will decide for each school what we are going to do. And I think in the same way that parents have to stand up and they say to the government, no, we will decide what we do in our home, and you can decide what you do in your home.
All right. 30 seconds, Mr. Singh. 15, in fact.
So, sorry about the disruption with my line, Sakina. Sakina, the question that we need to ask is which side of history are we on? As I've noted previously, we come from a violent past. We come from a past which legitimated a whole range of practices which we don't believe are acceptable today. Our Constitution is consistent with international trends in terms of promoting the rights of the child, and I think this is something which is clearly absent from the discourse coming from Mr. Rosenthal. Children are full citizens and they have rights. They're a particularly vulnerable group. We need to move towards a society which protects the vulnerable. We need to move towards a society which seeks to resolve its conflicts in nonviolent ways. The Commission does not seek to get into people's houses. What we're doing here is advocating for a principle which we believe is consistent with international norms, with the Constitution, and I'm encouraged by this debate because I believe this debate can only take our country forward and can only create a situation where there are greater protections and hopefully in the end government will also come on board and realize that these vital protections are required for the most vulnerable groups in our society, namely children.
Thank you so much to our guest this morning. That was Karam Singh, South African Human Rights Commission Provincial Manager in the Western Cape, and Philip Rosenthal, Director of Christian View Network, was also with us. And thanks to you for your participation. To spank or not to spank, you will decide. And it's time now for news with Kumbuzile Tabete.